In the autumn of 1991, on a gravel road outside of Morden in the Red River Valley of southern Manitoba, a 41-year-old woman named Agnes Kowalczyk spent $1, 3.40 on 12 second-hand wooden bee boxes, a second-hand extractor with a bent handle, and 3 packages of Italian honeybees from a supplier in Winkler who told her plainly that most people who started this way didn't make it past the second winter. The boxes were unpainted and smelled of old propolis and someone else's years. The extractor wobbled when you ran it. The bees arrived in screened packages the size of shoeboxes, buzzing with a low, constant energy that Agnes felt through her palms when she carried them to the truck. She loaded everything herself. She thanked the supplier, paid with a check, and drove the 40 minutes back to her property on Township Road 5 in the early afternoon, with the radio playing something she didn't listen to. When she turned off the main road onto her lane, her neighbor Clifton Hark was walking his fence line along the east edge of his canola field, and he watched her truck go past. He could see the wooden boxes stacked in the back, irregular and pale, against the gray October sky. He didn't wave, he watched. That was the beginning. Over the next 5 years, the community around Morden would have a story to tell. And like all stories in agricultural Manitoba, it moved. From the grain elevator to the hardware store, from the hardware store to the credit union, from the credit union to the rink parking lot on Saturday mornings. And at each stop, the story became a little more pointed. Because Agnes Kowalczyk, widow, market gardener, daughter of a Ukrainian wheat farmer from the Interlake, was not the kind of person anyone expected to be doing what she was doing. What she was doing looked to most people like stubbornness dressed up as an idea. Let me tell you about Agnes Kowalczyk, because what she did with those hives over the next 5 years only makes sense if you understand who she was and where she came from. Agnes was born in 1950 on a mixed farm 12 kilometers north of Gimli, the eldest of 3 children. Her father, Mykola Savchin, grew wheat and oats and kept a large kitchen garden that her mother tended, but that Mykola watched over with the same attention he gave the fields. He was not a man who separated things into categories. The bees in the clover at the edge of the garden, the robins working the furrows after a rain, the way the soil smelled different after a wet May than after a dry one. These were not separate subjects. They were all part of the same conversation the land was having with itself, and Mykola Savchin listened. He kept a journal, not a diary, nothing personal, just observations. The date, the weather, what was blooming, which insects he saw and where, how the clover looked along the ditch compared to the clover in the field. He had notebooks going back to 1958. When Agnes was old enough to walk the fields with him in the evenings, he made her slow down. "You don't understand a piece of land by driving past it," he told her once. "You understand it by being in it until it stops noticing you." Agnes walked slowly. She looked at things. Agnes married Bohdan Kowalczyk in 1973. Bohdan was a quiet, broad-shouldered man who had inherited a quarter section outside Morden from his uncle and had added to it gradually, growing mixed vegetables for the Winnipeg wholesale market and for 2 farmers' markets in the city. It was not a large operation, but it was a careful one, the kind of farm that ran on attention and long hours rather than on scale. They had no children. They had the farm. Bohdan died in February of 1989, a Tuesday, of a stroke in the kitchen. He was 53. Agnes called the ambulance from the phone on the wall and then sat with him on the floor until it came, because she was not a woman who could stand at a distance from the things that mattered to her. After the funeral, her sister-in-law drove up from Winnipeg and suggested she sell the property, move into town, let the land go to someone with the energy for it. Agnes thanked her for making the drive and said she needed to get back to the greenhouse. Her sister-in-law drove back to Winnipeg. Agnes went out to check her seedlings. She managed the market garden alone for 2 growing seasons before the bees. Let me tell you what Agnes saw in those first years without Bodan. She saw what her father had taught her to see, which was more than most people looked at. She saw that her yields were declining in ways that the rainfall and soils couldn't fully test. The cucumbers were setting fruit poorly. The cucumbers were setting fruit poorly. The squash had fewer pollinators working them than she'd counted in the mid-'80s. The borage she planted along the edges of her beds, which had always hummed in July, hummed less. She walked her property in the evenings, the way her father had walked his fields, slowly, looking at things, and she noticed that the insect life she'd taken for granted for 20 years was thinner than it had been. Not gone, just thinner, but like a room that has lost some of its furniture, and you can't say immediately which pieces are missing, only that the space feels larger than it should. She had been reading. Not the market gardening publications that came to the house, though she read those too. She was reading something different, a newsletter from a research cooperative in Ontario that circulated among a small network of farmers interested in what was then being called integrated pest management. And within that network, a growing body of observation about pollinator decline in agricultural landscapes. The research was still early. The word colony collapse was not yet in common use, but the pattern was being documented. Monoculture expansion, increased pesticide load in the landscape, loss of hedgerows and marginal habitat, and a corresponding drop in wild bee populations across the agricultural interior of the country. The managed honeybee, Apis mellifera, was not a perfect substitute for wild pollinators, but it was a measurable one. You could count hives, you could track yields, you could build a case. Agnes had never kept bees. Neither had her father, though he had talked about it. But she had read enough by the summer of 1991 to believe that the question her declining pollination rates were asking had a potential answer, and that the answer involved bees, and that the way most commercial beekeepers in the valley managed their colonies, moving hives frequently, treating routinely with miticides, supplementing with sugar syrup through the dearth, was not the only way. There was another approach being practiced by a small number of beekeepers in Quebec and in parts of Europe that emphasized what they called treatment-free management, selecting for survivor stock, allowing colonies to express natural resistance to Varroa destructor, the mite that had arrived in North America in the late 1980s. And was in the process of devastating managed honeybee populations across the continent. The approach was controversial. Most beekeepers considered it irresponsible. If you didn't treat for Varroa, they said, your bees would die. The mite load would build until the colony collapsed. You'd lose everything and spread mites to your neighbors in the process. Agnes had read the arguments on both sides. She thought the conventional side might be right. She thought there was also a possibility it was wrong. She thought the only way to find out was to try. She started small. 12 hives in an orchard block at the southeast corner of her property, placed at the edge of a mixed hedgerow of chokecherry and buffaloberry and native grasses that she had never cleared, because Bowden had always said the birds needed it, and she had agreed. She did not treat the hives with miticides. She monitored her mite loads using alcohol wash counts, recording the numbers in a notebook. The same brand of spiral-bound notebook her father had used, because she had bought a case of them in Gimli years ago and still had most of them left. When a colony showed high mite loads and poor hygienic behavior, she did not treat it. She let it weaken. If it died, she noted the date and the conditions, and she replaced it with a swarm she caught or a split from a colony that had survived. What the neighbors could not understand, what Clifton Hark watched from his fence line and could not explain to anyone who asked, was the absence of intervention. That was the thing. Not what she was doing, but what she was not doing. Every beekeeper in the valley treated. You treated in the spring, you treated in the fall. You treated if the counts were high. You treated preventively if they weren't. The chemicals were approved. The protocols were established. The suppliers stocked the products. Stocked the products. Not treating was not a philosophy that anyone in southern Manitoba had considered, not because they hadn't thought about it, but because the consequences of Varroa untreated were too visible and too fast. You saw what happened to an untreated hive. It was not subtle. What Clifton Hark told his wife in November was that Agnes Kowalczyk was letting her bees die on purpose. His wife told her cousin in December. By the following spring, if you drove past the Kowalczyk place on Township Road 5 and happened to know what you were looking at, you might slow down to see the hives at the edge of the hedgerow, white and pale yellow against the green of early June, more of them than seemed reasonable for a market garden that size. And you might shake your head, because everyone knew what happened when you didn't treat. The story at the grain elevator went like this. Agnes Kowalczyk had lost her way a little after Bodan died. It happened to people who tried to run a farm operation alone, but it was a dry who got too deep into books and newsletters and started to believe that the people who had been doing this for generations were missing something. She had this idea from Ontario about letting her bees build resistance. She wasn't treating for Varroa. She was going to lose every colony she had by the second winter, and then where would she be? The story was told with a kind of watchful concern. Agnes was not a woman people disliked. She was a woman people felt responsible for, a widow alone on a quarter section with those untreated hives and that Ontario newsletter, and no one to tell her when an idea had gone further than the evidence. In the second year, 1992, Agnes built a record-keeping system she pinned to the wall of her potting shed, a hand-drawn chart of her 12 hives, numbered 1 through 12. For each hive, she tracked the mite wash counts by month, the brood pattern scores she assigned on her weekly inspections, the swarming behavior, the winter survival. She was also tracking her garden yields, crop by crop, bed by bed, comparing them to the baseline averages she and Bodan had kept since 1981. What she was beginning to see, and she was careful, because she knew she wanted to see it, was that the beds closest to the hives were setting fruit at a higher rate than they had in the 3 seasons before the bees arrived. The cucumbers were fuller. The squash had more fruit per vine. The borage was alive with movement in a way she hadn't seen in years. She didn't tell anyone. She wrote it down. She was also corresponding by letter with 2 other beekeepers. One in the eastern townships of Quebec, who had been selecting for hygienic behavior in his colonies since 1988, and one in British Columbia who had gone treatment-free 4 years earlier and had lost 2/3 of his hives the first winter and built back from the survivors. These letters were long and specific, covering mite counts and brood patterns and how to read a colony that was managing its own mite load versus one that was losing the fight. Agnes's postage costs were higher that year than they had ever been, which her neighbor Clifton noticed because their rural mail route shared a carrier, and he occasionally saw the volume of correspondence going to and from her box. He mentioned it to his wife. His wife mentioned it to her friend at the credit union. The letters and the untreated hives merged into a single story about a woman who had found a community of people somewhere far away who believed what she believed, which was a sign in itself, because if the idea were good, you wouldn't have to go to Quebec to find it. The laughter in the hardware store was not mean. It was the laughter of people who were waiting to be proven right and felt the outcome was not really in doubt. By 1993, if you mentioned Agnes Kowalczyk's bees at the elevator, people smiled before you finished the sentence. There were two things happening on the Kowalczyk property in 1993 that nobody driving past on Township Road 5 could see. The first was the colonies. Of the 12 original hives, 7 had survived 2 full winters without treatment. 3 had died, 1 in the first winter and 2 in the second, and Agnes had replaced them with splits from survivors, specifically from colonies that had shown the highest hygienic scores on her inspections, the ones that removed varroa-infested pupae from sealed brood cells most quickly and most completely. The 7 survivors were not surviving the way treated colonies survived, which was to say by suppressing the mite load with chemicals and starting each season at roughly the same baseline. They were surviving differently. Their mite wash counts in October, before winter, were lower than they had been in the summer, which was the reverse of what happened in untreated colonies that were losing the fight. Something in those 7 colonies was managing the mite load actively. She didn't fully understand the mechanism yet. She wrote down what she saw. The second thing was the garden. Her total marketable yield in 1993 was the highest it had been since 1986. She was selling more at the Winnipeg markets than she had since Baudon was alive. Her fruit set percentages, which she had been tracking since 1989, were up across every cucurbit crop, and significantly up in her field tomatoes, which had historically underperformed in the valley's short season. She did not mention this at the hardware store. She did not mention it at the credit union. She had her father's instinct about these things, which was that the time to speak was after the thing had proven itself past any reasonable argument. She was still waiting for that. In the summer of 1993, a graduate student from the University of Manitoba named Thomas Ellery knocked on Agnes's door. He was studying pollinator services in fragmented agricultural landscapes, and he had been trying to find anyone in southern Manitoba who was keeping bees without miticides. He'd called the provincial apiarist's office, which had expressed serious reservations about his line of inquiry. He'd called 2 beekeeping associations, both of which had told him the same thing. The approach was irresponsible, and he shouldn't be encouraging it. He'd written to the beekeeper in Quebec, who had written back and given him Agnes's address. Agnes made him tea and took him to the hedgerow for 2 hours. Ellery was 26 years old, raised in Winnipeg, and knew bees primarily from the literature rather than from years of working with them. But he was careful, and he asked precise questions, and he got close to the hives and observed the behavior Agnes pointed out. He looked at her charts. He looked at her mite count records. He looked at the brood pattern scores for the surviving colonies and asked her to describe what those colonies had looked like in the first spring after arrival, before she knew which ones would make it. Before he left, he asked if he could come back the following summer with instruments and do proper comparative measurements. He wanted to document the characteristics of her surviving colonies against her replacement stock and against a conventionally managed operation nearby. Agnes said yes. She did not tell him which nearby operation she had in mind for comparison. Ellery came back in May of 1994 with a second student, a refractometer, a high-speed camera for recording uncapping behavior, and a plan that would take most of a summer. Meanwhile, the story in the community had shifted slightly. It had been 3 years now, 3 winters, 3 springs of Agnes opening her hives and finding, against what everyone had predicted, that most of them were still alive. The people who drove past on Township Road 5 had started to notice something they couldn't quite name. The hives were still there. That was the thing. You expected them to be gone by now, and they weren't gone. Clifton Hark had gotten out of his truck one morning in April and walked to the fence line and stood there for a few minutes looking at the hedgerow, at the hives visible through the chokecherry. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. He drove home without saying anything to his wife about it. At the elevator in June, the story about Agnes and her bees was told by a man named Bert, who drove a truck for one of the larger grain operations in the area, and who had been telling it since 1992. But this time, when the knowing smiles came, they were a little quicker to fade. A couple of the men in the lineup didn't smile at all. One of them had lost 14 hives to varroa the previous winter and was not in the mood. In the summer of 1994, Manitoba had a dry August. Not a drought, not catastrophic, but the kind of extended dry stretch that showed up differences in how well plant populations were supported through stress. The market gardens in the valley that depended on manual pollination or on rented commercial hives, which were moved in and out with the bloom, had a difficult August. Kakishal. The commercial hives were pulled early because the beekeeper who owned them had other contracts to service, and the dearth made the colonies defensive and difficult to move near harvest. The growers, who had counted on those hives for their late-season crops, had a gap that the wild pollinators, already thinned by a decade of landscape change, could not fill. Agnes's garden did not have a gap. Her colonies were resident. They had been in the same hedgerow for 3 years, and they knew the landscape the way a resident population knows a landscape, not as a single crop in bloom, but as a continuous sequence of forage. They worked the buckwheat cover crop she planted not in the gaps between market beds. They worked the native flowers in the hedgerow. They worked the red clover she had let go to flower along the lane. In August, when the dearth tightened, they were still working, still present, and her late-season squash set fruit at a rate she hadn't seen in years. Ellery called her in November from his office at the university. His voice had that careful quality young researchers use when the numbers are saying something they weren't fully expecting. He told her that the hygienic behavior scores in her surviving colonies were statistically distinct from the replacement stock. He had filmed the uncapping behavior in 8 of her original survivors and 3 of the replacement colonies, and the difference was measurable and consistent. The survivors were removing varroa-infested pupae at a rate nearly twice that of the replacements. He had also found, in 3 of her colonies, evidence of what appeared to be suppressed mite reproduction, a phenomenon that had been documented in European-resistant populations, but that had not previously been recorded in Manitoba stock. There was a pause on the line. "How certain are you?" Agnes asked. "Certain enough to write it up," Ellery said. "This is real, Mrs. Kowalczyk." Agnes thanked him, wrote the figures down, and filed the page with her hive charts in the drawer under the potting bench. She did not call anyone. She went the hedge route, to the hedgerow, and stood for a while in the November cold, and looked at the hives, quiet under their mouse guards, the bees clustered inside, doing the slow work of winter. She had been keeping records for 4 years, waiting for someone to put a number on what she thought she was seeing. The number was real. The colonies were real. But she was her father's daughter, and her father had never announced a thing before it had proven itself completely. The winter of 1994 to 1995 was hard. January brought a cold snap that dropped temperatures to -38 for 11 consecutive nights, the coldest stretch in the valley since 1982. The wind was constant. Agnes had wrapped her hives in roofing felt and packed straw bales around the outside rows, and she still lost 2 colonies to the cold, which she noted in the record without emotion, the way her father had noted a bad night of frost in his grain journal. The 10 that survived came through in March with brood in the frames and queens that were already laying. In April of 1995, the Pembina Valley Beekeepers Association held its spring meeting at the community hall in Altona. 41 members attended. The agenda covered provincial apiary regulations, a new Varroa treatment product recently approved for use in Canada, the upcoming honey show, and a brief discussion of a European research paper on naturally selected mite-resistant colonies that one of the members had printed out and distributed. Agnes Kowalczyk attended, as she had every year since Bodon died. She sat near the back. She did not speak. Near the end of the meeting, a larger-scale beekeeper named James Friesen, who ran close to 300 colonies across 3 counties and was the most respected commercial beekeeper in the region, held up the European paper. He had questions about it. Had anyone in the room tried anything along these lines? He looked at the room. There was a short silence. Agnes has been doing something like this for 4 years. It was the woman next to Agnes who said it, a beekeeper from Winkler, named Carol, who had bought bees from the same Winkler supplier, and who had been watching Agnes's operation with quiet attention since 1992. She said it without drama, just as a statement of fact, and then she looked sideways at Agnes. Every head in the room turned. Agnes looked at James Friesen. She looked at the paper in his hand. She recognized the researchers named in it. She had been reading their work since 1993. "How long?" Friesen asked. 4 years, she said, since the fall of 1991. The room was quiet in the way a room goes quiet when something recalibrates, not with a sound, just a settling. "I would like to hear about that," Friesen said. What happened over the following months was not a single event. There was no ceremony. There was no day when the valley gathered and Agnes stood before them and delivered a judgment. What happened was quieter, and its quietness was what made it last. James Friesen drove out to the Kowalczyk place in May. He was a man who had been keeping bees since he was 14, who had built his operation on careful management and consistent treatment protocols, and he did not arrive with an open mind so much as with a willingness to look at the evidence. He walked the hedgerow with Agnes, and she opened several of the surviving hives for him and let him look at the brood. He was a good enough beekeeper to see immediately what she was showing him. The brood pattern in the old survivors was unusually clean. The cells were properly capped, no sunken or discolored cappings, no signs of the brood diseases that ran through stressed colonies. He stood at the 3rd hive for a long time without speaking. "My grandfather," Friesen said finally, "used to say you could tell a good beekeeper by whether the bees were calm when you opened them or whether they ran." He looked up. "These bees are calm." Agnes said nothing. Friesen stood there a moment longer. He said, "I've been treating twice a year for 6 years. My mite counts still come back high every fall." Agnes waited. "I've been thinking about what it means," he said, "if the treatment is the reason the resistance never develops." He ordered his first package of survivor stock from a Quebec breeder in June. Clifton Hark came by on a Thursday morning without calling. Agnes was doing a hive inspection on the south end of the hedgerow, and he came through the gate and stood watching from a distance, not wanting to disturb the work. When she was done and had her veil off, he walked over. "I've driven past this place for 4 years," he said. She waited. "I told my wife last winter you were going to lose everything by spring." He was looking at the hives. He was not looking at her. "I know," Agnes said. "I lost a colony last fall to chalk brood, and I called the extension office, and they said to treat for this and supplement with that, and none of it made any sense to me." He paused. "I'd like to see your records, if that's all right." "Come into the potting shed," she said. The last to come was a beekeeper named Walt Penner, who ran 60 colonies on his property east of Morden, and who had been the most consistent voice at the elevator and at the association meetings for the position that Agnes was going to fail, and that her failure would damage her neighbors by spreading mites through the area. Walt had not been cruel about it. He had stated it as an observable fact. He was a man who spoke in observable facts, and for 4 years the observable fact had been that treatment-free beekeeping in the Manitoba climate was not viable, and that the people in Europe doing it were working with stock and landscapes that had no relevance to the valley. Walt Penner came to Agnes's door on a Saturday morning in the first week of June 1995. He was carrying a jar of his own honey. He handed it to her when she opened the door. "My count this spring was higher than last year," he said. "Yours wasn't." Agnes had heard this from Ellery, who had done comparative counts across 6 operations in the valley as part of his follow-up work. "Come in," she said. "I'll put the kettle on. Let me tell you about the summer of 1995. Because the summer of 1995 was the one that settled the question for the people who had not yet asked it. July brought a second dry stretch, harder than 1994, and it arrived on top of an early-season cool spell in June that had delayed bloom timing across the valley by almost 2 weeks. A drought hot. The commercial hive operators who serviced growers in the region were caught between the delayed bloom and their summer movement schedules. Several large vegetable operations had hive coverage gaps in their critical pollination windows. The fruit set numbers would not be fully known until harvest, but by mid-July the people who walked their fields could already see the difference between the beds that had been covered and the beds that hadn't. Agnes's beds had been covered. They had been covered by the same resident colonies that had been working the same hedgerow for 4 years. Colonies that had not been moved and did not need to be. Colonies whose foragers had mapped every inch of her property in a radius that extended across her neighbor's land as well. Clifton Hark's canola in particular, which set a yield per acre that summer that surprised him when he combined it, and that he mentioned to Agnes in passing one September morning, without drawing any conclusion from it, or at least without saying any conclusion out loud. Agnes's colonies came out of the summer with mite counts that were, in Ellery's phrase when he called in October, statistically remarkable. He was preparing a paper. He wanted to name her operation in it. She thought about it for 2 weeks. She said yes. In November of 1995, the Pembina Valley Beekeepers Association held a special session, not the spring meeting. A session called specifically by James Friesen, for the specific purpose of hearing from Agnes Kowalczyk about what she had been doing on Township Road 5 for the past 4 years. 62 members attended. That was 20 more than had come to the spring meeting. Agnes had not prepared remarks. She had her hive charts rolled and tucked under her arm. She had a copy of Ellery's preliminary findings. She had her father's observation notebook from 1971, which had nothing to do with beekeeping, but which she had brought with her without fully explaining why, even to herself. She stood at the front of the room, and she unrolled the charts and she explained them. She was not a talker. She had never spoken in front of a room in her life. But the charts were not a speech. They were records, and she explained them the way her father had explained a field to her, plainly, methodically, one season at a time. She told them what she had started with in the fall of 1991. She told them what she had read and why. She told them about the survivor selection process and what it had cost in lost colonies and how long it had taken to see results. She showed them Ellery's data. She talked about July and what her beds had done. She talked about the canola she hadn't planted and hadn't asked anyone to plant, but that had been visited by her bees all summer anyway. When she finished, James Friesen asked the first question. Walt Penner asked the second. Clifton Hark, who had not been a member of the association and had come anyway, sat in the back row and did not ask a question. He held his hat in both hands, and he listened. The questions went on for an hour and 40 minutes. Agnes answered everyone. She said, "I don't know 3 times, each time about something specific," and wrote down names and addresses for people who might be able to help. Near the end, the man from Winkler, the supplier who had sold her the original bees in 1991, raised his hand from the 3rd row. "Agnes," he said, "I have to ask you something." She looked at him. "When you started in 1991 and you weren't treating, and everybody, including me, told you it wasn't going to work." He paused. "Did you ever think we were right?" The room was quiet. Agnes looked at the man from Winkler for a moment. "Every winter," she said. "That's why I kept counting the mites." The room was quiet in a different way then. The kind of quiet that means something has been understood and there is nothing useful to add. Let me tell you how it ended, or rather, how it didn't end, because what Agnes Kowalczyk began in the autumn of 1991 did not end. It continued. By 1997, 9 operations in the Pembina Valley were using survivor-selected stock and reducing their treatment protocols, some eliminating them entirely, some moving to a monitoring-based approach that treated only when counts reached defined thresholds rather than on a calendar schedule. The results varied, because results always vary, because patience is not evenly distributed, and neither is the willingness to watch something fail for 2 years before it shows you what it can do. But 9 operations were trying. James Friesen was one of them. By 1998, Friesen had identified 4 colonies in his operation that were showing the suppressed mite reproduction that Ellery had documented in Agnes's survivors. He was breeding from those 4 and culling the rest slowly, a process that would take years and that he undertook with the thoroughness of a man who, once convinced, commits completely. He called Agnes sometimes in the evenings with questions. She answered them. She never said she had told him so. She just answered the questions. Clifton Hark put in 2 hives in 1996. He bought survivor stock from the Quebec breeder Agnes recommended. He lost 1 colony the first winter and kept the other, and split it in the spring. By the 3rd year he had 4 colonies, and his canola yields had become a subject of conversation at the elevator, not the kind of conversation anyone was explaining yet, but the kind where numbers are mentioned and heads are nodded, and someone changes the subject. Walt Penner was the last, but it was a dry July. Walt had reduced his treatments to once a year by 1997 and was monitoring religiously, and the data he was collecting was becoming difficult to argue with. He called Agnes one Sunday in the fall of 1997, and they talked for 90 minutes about threshold management and what the winter cluster behavior of resistant colonies looked like compared to susceptible ones. And the conversation had a quality that Walt mentioned to his wife afterward, which was that at no point in the entire call did Agnes Kowalczyk make him feel foolish for having taken so long. Thomas Ellery finished his doctorate in 1997. One chapter of his dissertation concerned Agnes's operation specifically. The chapter was titled Varroa Resistance in Self-Selected Honeybee Colonies Under Non-Treatment Management. Evidence from a Southern Manitoba Case Study, 1991 to 1996. It was formal academic language for something that was not a formal academic subject. What it said, in plain terms, was that 4 years of selection pressure without chemical intervention had produced colonies with measurable, heritable resistance characteristics that were not present in the replacement stock, and that those characteristics were consistent with the suppressed mite reproduction and hygienic behavior documented in naturally resistant populations in Europe, and that their presence in a Manitoba populations suggested that the capacity for resistance was not geographically limited, only latency limited, waiting for the conditions under which it could emerge. Agnes read the chapter. She thought the language was too careful, but she understood why it had to be. In the spring of 1999, the Manitoba Apiculture Industry Association, the same provincial body whose office had expressed reservations when Ellery first began his inquiry, held a field day on integrated Varroa management. They invited Agnes Kowalczyk's operation as the demonstration site. 49 beekeepers came from across the province, parking along Township Road 5 and walking through the gate in their veils and jackets in the cool May morning. Agnes met them at the gate and took them to the hedgerow. She opened the old survivor hives first, the ones that had been in place for 8 years, the ones she had not shown anyone for the first 3 years because she hadn't been sure enough of what she was seeing. She walked them through the behavior she was looking for when she assessed a colony. The uncapping of infested cells, the grooming, the small signals that a colony was managing something its neighbors were not. She showed them her charts on the wall of the potting shed. 8 years of records in pencil in the same spiral-bound notebooks her father had used. She let them hold the frames and look at the brood. She let them do their own mite wash counts and write down what they found. An older beekeeper from the Interlake region, a man in his 70s who had been keeping bees since before Agnes was born, did his count in the 3rd hive, and then walked to the edge of the hedgerow and stood looking out at Agnes's garden beds. The chokecherry coming into early bloom, the buffalo berry just behind it. My father kept bees on this same kind of land, he said. He treated when the regulations told him to treat. He didn't know there was another way. Neither did I, Agnes said. Not until I started reading. What do you read? He asked. Agnes told him. She wrote the names down on a page from the small notebook she carried in her jacket pocket, the same kind her father had kept since 1958. The man folded the page and tucked it into his breast pocket. I have 40 colonies out near Arborg, he said. He was looking at the survivor hive, at the bees moving calmly on the landing board. I lost 12 last winter, treated twice, and still lost 12. He paused. I'm 69 years old. Is it too late to start over with the stock? Agnes looked at him. It took 4 winters to get here, she said. You might not see all of it, but you'll see enough to know. The man nodded. He put his veil back on and looked at the hive for a while longer. They stood in the hedgerow. For a little longer, the 49 beekeepers and Agnes Kowalczyk, looking at the colonies that 8 years ago had been 12 unpainted boxes, and a question that everyone around her had considered already answered. The chokecherry was white along the hedgerow, and the bees were in it, working the way bees work when they have chosen a landscape as their own, unhurried, complete, following lines of scent that no map has ever recorded. The May wind came across the valley the way it always comes, steady and indifferent, and the hedgerow moved in it. Agnes watched the bees the way her father had taught her to watch a field, which was the way you watch something that is telling you something if you are willing to slow down and stay long enough to hear it. 12 hives. A bent extractor. A stack of notebooks from a hardware store in Gimli. A woman who opened her hives every week in all weather and wrote down what she found. 5 years of being the cautionary story told at the elevator and the association meetings and the credit union parking lot. And then, the colonies, still there, still working, resistant to a thing that everyone said they could not be resistant to. That is the distance between someone who manages what is and someone who asks what could be. Agnes Kowalczyk started with bees that everyone said would be dead by the second winter, on land that the experts said required intervention, with stock that everyone said had no resistance to give. She kept her records, she kept her counts, she kept her father's notebooks beside her own, on the shelf above the potting bench. And in the summer of 1995, when the dry stretch came, and the dry salts and the commercial hives moved on, and the valley's pollinators thinned to what the landscape could support, on its own, the colonies on the Kowalczyk property, 4-year veterans of selection pressure that no one had believed would produce anything but dead bees, were still in the hedgerow. Still working, still there, not forever, just longer than anyone had said they would be. That was enough.